Well, good morning. My name is Ryan Weekley, and my family just moved into the Phoenix area a few weeks ago, and we are so excited to be a part of the Phoenix Church family. And on the screen is a little picture of our family. That's our 2.5-year-old daughter, Avery, who I hope all of you will get to meet here soon. But we are here to serve in both the youth and family ministry and the midpoint sector specifically, and we're very happy to be here. For the month of February, we've been going through a series entitled Stronger Love. And in week 1, members of our squad spoke on loving our neighbor, right? We learned from the text of John 4 and Jesus' conversation with the Samaritan woman. Last week, for week 2, Forrest spoke on our love for our community. And we looked at Jesus feeding the 5,000. And that was an event through which Jesus challenged the people's faith and compassion. And so today we're going to continue the series, and we're going to begin in the first letter of John. So go ahead and turn to 1 John chapter 4. The title of our lesson this morning is Love Like Jesus. Love like Jesus. And as we're turning over to that first passage in 1 John 4, I want us to think of a time when you felt true love. Think of a time when you felt true love. And I'm not simply talking about romantic love. Perhaps some of us haven't been in love in that way, and that's okay. I'm talking about genuine, sincere love toward another person or from another person. For me, I remember as I was graduating college, you can think of a graduation ceremony. There are so many people out there, and you're just waiting for hours for your name to be called, right? I remember I was sitting there. It was the time for our row to go up, and I went up the stairs. I shook the dean's hand. I got my degree, and I looked to my left, and as I start going down the ramp, I see my dad front and center. And my dad had fought through the crowd, literally, to get to that spot, to see me walk down those stairs with my degree after they called my name. And I remember the smile on his face. He was so proud of me, and I just felt that sincere love in that moment. It was so special. For Virginia and I, we've been married about 8.5 years, and my wife is incredible. I can't wait for you all to meet her if you haven't already. But I remember before we were married, one of the times that I felt, this is the girl. This is the one for me. Is she decided to make a box, and on the outside of this box, she wrote down the different things she loved about me. And she put my favorite candy, Strawberry Belts. I love sour candy. All right, so she put Strawberry Belts in this box and drove all the way to my house and dropped it off. And that was when I was like, that was one of the things, hey, I'm sold. This is it. And so we could think about these moments of sincere, genuine love. And let's read together here in 1 John 4 and verse 7. The Bible reads, "Dear friends, let us love one another, for love comes from God. Everyone who loves has been born of God and knows God. Whoever does not love does not know God, because God is love. This is how God showed his love among us. He sent his one and only Son into the world that we might live through him. This is love. Not that we loved God, but that he loved us and sent his Son as an atoning sacrifice for our sins. Dear friends, since God loved us, we also ought to love one another. No one has ever seen God, but if we love one another, God lives in us, and his love is made complete in us." Jump down to verse 16. "And so we know and rely on the love God has for us. God is love. Whoever lives in love lives in God and God in them. This is how love is made complete among us, so that we will have confidence on the day of judgment. In this world, we are like Jesus. There is no fear in love, but perfect love drives out fear, because fear has to do with punishment. The one who fears is not made perfect in love. We love because he first loved us." I feel this passage is the perfect place to start as we dive into this topic, Right? First John is making these clear and powerful statements as to the source of love. He writes, love comes from God. He says both in verse 8 and in verse 16, God is love. Think about that for a second. God is love. I love that. That love completely describes the character and the heart of God. That God is so rich in love that that word can be used to describe his very being. It is an essential aspect of his character. Could the same be said about us? Could the same be said of your family? Could the same be said of you? That you are love. You know, John continues and he talks about how this great and abounding love is shown by God. You know, this relentless love has been put on display. Verse 10 said that, hey, this is love. Not that we loved God, but that God loved us and sent his son as an atoning sacrifice for our sin. See, for John, the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus have defined forever what love is. That before we knew him or believed in him or obeyed or followed him, Jesus lived and died for us. And the judgment that we deserve because of our own choices and our own rebellion, that has been taken away. And by his love and by his blood, we in this world can be made new. Amen? You know, John continues to write and he says, you know, God's love is the motivation, the driving force of our love for others. If you go back to the beginning of that passage in verse 7, the Greek phrase there's two words, agapetoi, agapomen, which means those who are loved, let us love. Think of that phrase for a moment. Those who are loved, let us love. So when we come to know and experience the love of God, then we are compelled to love others in the same way. Right? And so to love others should not be a chore or a burden. It is a privileged response to God's love for us. Right? It's amazing. Our love for others should be a guarantee if we have known and experienced the love of God in our own lives. Those who are loved, let us love. And finally, John speaks to the potential power, the impact of love. In verse 12, I love this. He says, you know what? No one has ever seen God, but if we love one another, God lives in us, and his love is made complete in us. And think about that. No one has ever seen God, yet they can see him in a sense, or they can get to know and experience God through the love that we have for one another. That's awesome. Right? We can help people see God by the way we love them. You know, the cross is an event that we can forever point to as God's demonstration of love and grace. But God's people don't simply point to an event as proof. We are the proof. God continues to show his love among us through us. Right? And so throughout the passage, John is inspiring the people to love like Jesus, to imitate his love, to extend his love, to be the continuing example of his love. And I want to ask here at this point, how are we doing in this? Does your love look like the love of Christ? You know, our love for our families, our coworkers, our neighbors, our teammates, for strangers, for the marginalized. Do we love like Jesus? And for the remainder of our time today, I want us to look at a specific moment in the life of Christ where this great love is put on display. All right, go ahead and turn to John chapter 19. And we're going to jump down and begin in verse 25 of the chapter. And in that verse, we're brought into the story of Jesus' crucifixion in a very special point. You know, at this point, Jesus had been arrested and disowned, whipped, beaten, mocked, and nailed to the cross. And we're brought into this moment where there's people watching from a crowd, and Jesus connects with a few key people. So let's go ahead and read here. John chapter 19 and verse 25. Near the cross of Jesus stood his mother's sister, Mary the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. When Jesus saw his mother there, and the disciple whom he loved standing nearby, he said to her, "Woman, here is your son." And to the disciple, "Here is your mother." From that time on, this disciple took her into his home. You know, one of the things that strikes me about this passage is, first, the love of Jesus is attentive. The love of Jesus is attentive. You know, I want each of us to consider the perspective of Mary this morning. Put yourself in her place. Imagine what you'd be feeling, the agony you might be experiencing as you watch your son suffer in this way. Right? She would witness firsthand the pain, humiliation, the shame, and eventually the death of her own son. Right? It's difficult to comprehend. And it's interesting, at the beginning of Jesus' life, you know, in Luke chapter 2, Joseph and Mary take Jesus to the temple for dedication. And a man named Simeon sees the family and takes the boy Jesus in his arms, and he blesses Jesus. Yet along with that blessing comes a forewarning for Mary. You know, he tells her that Jesus will reveal the hearts of the masses. But at the same time, a sword will pierce her heart as well. And I'm sure Mary experienced that piercing throughout Jesus' ministry as he's rejected and opposed and slandered. But here in John 19, I mean, of all those who looked upon Jesus at the cross, I'm sure none suffered as much as his dear mother. Right? And as she watches from a distance, Jesus, he sees her. Right? He sees her pain. He recognizes her anguish. And like he had done so many times before, he attends to her needs. Right? And that's just who Jesus is. Right? He was always looking for ways to serve. Looking for opportunities to speak truth and life into others. He's always looking for moments where he could break boundaries through love and compassion. Are we the same? Are we attentive, looking, waiting for opportunities to love those around us? You know, when we're at home or on a Zoom call or in fellowship, are we looking for ways to build one another up? When we're at work or at school or at the store or at the park, are we looking? Are we attentive for opportunities to share the love of God with our community who so desperately needs it? Right? Remember John's point from his letter. Those who are loved, let us love. Because we have known the love of God personally. Our heads should just be on a swivel, looking for any and every opportunity to love. And you know, not only was Jesus looking for opportunities to love, he was willing to be interrupted by the needs of others. You know, no matter his agenda or his aims, the needs of others stopped him in his tracks. A great example of this is Mark chapter 5, where Jesus, he arrives by boat to a place and immediately a crowd just gathers around him. And a synagogue ruler, he kind of, gets through the crowd and he comes to Jesus and pleads with Jesus. Jesus, please come and see my daughter. My daughter is sick. She's dying. She needs your help. Now, Jesus, he just arrived. A crowd is all over looking for his help. And yet, Jesus is willing to be interrupted by the needs of this family. So he goes with the synagogue ruler. And as he's on his way to meet the ruler's daughter, a woman who had been bleeding for 12 years, she fights her way through the crowd and touches Jesus' cloak. Now Jesus, he's already been interrupted and he's on his way to go heal a child, and yet he stops to acknowledge the woman. personally. Right? Jesus, he was looking for every opportunity to love, and he was willing for his agenda to be interrupted by the needs of others. You know, sadly, some of us are so caught up in our own lives that we miss out on the opportunity to love like Jesus. You know, the opportunities are there, but we don't see them because our lives are so packed. They're so crowded. And it doesn't matter where the Spirit might be leading us, how the Spirit might be leading us to love, if we're not giving the Spirit any time in our day to speak. So I want to ask this morning, how could you grow to be more attentive to the needs of others? What habits or patterns in your life can be altered in order to create more opportunities to love? The love of Jesus is attentive. And second, the love of Jesus is selfless. You know, we considered Mary's perspective before. Now let's think of Jesus. Think of what he had been through before this point, right? He had already experienced every kind of pain imaginable: physical, emotional, relational, spiritual pain. And let's be honest, if there were ever a point where Jesus could be focused on himself, this might be the time, right? If there were ever a time for Jesus to think about his own needs for just a second, this was it. And considering everything he has endured and is literally enduring at the time, I don't think any of us would fault him for that. Yet even in the midst of his greatest trial, he is still focused on others. The love of Jesus is selfless. And I love how his example shines so bright and in contrast to the world around us, right? The patterns of this world are much more focused on the self, much more concerned with what I want, what I need, what's good for me. And if we're not careful, that kind of thinking can even infiltrate our families and even the family of God. A place that's meant to be characterized by love and sacrifice and service becomes more about meeting the needs of the individual. So I ask you this morning, is there any place in which this kind of self-focused thinking has creeped into your life, into your heart? You know, Jesus' selfless love, it offers the world a different kind of existence. And at times this point can be a tough one because each of us, many times, each of us have very legitimate needs, right? We can't always give from a place of joy or abundance. I'd imagine even those watching this, there are many who are in need even now. And this, I believe, is one of the incredible blessings of God's church, that in God's family, if all of us are committed to selfless love and sacrifice, then all are loved and built up. You know, Proverbs 11 speaks to this. In verse 25, it says, "A generous person will prosper. Whoever refreshes others will be refreshed." So the love of Jesus is attentive. The love of Jesus is selfless. Thirdly, the love of Jesus creates family. Let's read the passage again in verse 26 of John 19. When Jesus saw his mother there, and the disciple whom he loved standing nearby, he said to her, "Woman, here is your son." And to the disciple, "Here is your mother." From that time on, the disciple took her into his home. You know, there's an interesting little mystery here, one that we won't get to dive into too deeply this morning, but, you know, we could ask, okay, who is the disciple whom Jesus loved? Who is this man who took Mary in as his own mother? You know, tradition says this is John, the author of the gospel himself. You know, others believe it to be Lazarus. Still others believe it to be kind of an unnamed disciple in the gospel. And no matter who this man might be, we see something incredibly profound in the words of Jesus. Jesus sees the agony of his mother. He understands that she will need support and comfort in the days ahead. And so he creates new family ties between the two of them. Woman, here is your son. And to the disciple, here is your mother. And think for those two, think of how unusual and awkward that might be. Right? These two who are unrelated, who legally have no ties or no obligation to one another, are called by Jesus to be family. To love and support and embrace and care for one another as if they were blood. Right? And this is exactly what the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus does for all humanity. Those who follow Jesus are brought into the family of God. We are brothers and sisters, sons and daughters, co-heirs with Christ. And this new family is to be perfectly united, of one heart and mind, led by Jesus, empowered by the Spirit, participating together in the will and the mission of God. I want to ask, have you embraced this new family? You know, the disciple took Mary into his own home, cared for her as if she were his own flesh and blood. And sadly, you know, at times, we can fool ourselves by thinking that we don't need each other. You know, we can strike out on our own, even spiritually. And as we fight for independence, it's sad that we miss the point of what God is doing through Jesus. You know, in Jesus, a new community is being created to function together as God's people in this world. And if we feel like we don't need the church, or we don't need input, or confession, or friendship, or training, then we are missing out on a critical piece of the gospel. I want you to evaluate this morning, what is your disposition toward the church? Does your love create and sustain family? You know, I think this point means so much to me in my life and my story. You know, my parents were divorced when I was really young. I never really knew them together as a couple. And we lived in San Diego, and my mom was a single mom with myself and my older sister for a while until she was invited to church when I was about 4 years old. And my mom got baptized, and a couple years later, she started going on dates in the church, which was a little odd at the time, but she met a man named Dave. And Dave had two young boys of his own, and they both got remarried to one another when I was about 7 or 8. And at that time, you know, honestly, it was awkward. I didn't know how to act. I didn't know what to think about it. You know, I still had my dad in the picture, and I still had a relationship with him. So, you know, I didn't think much of it. I didn't call my dad or my stepdad Dad. I didn't really know much about him or want to know that much about him. I didn't really desire to be that close to this guy, right? The stepdad. And I tell you what, from the very beginning, my stepdad treated me like I was his own son. You know, he and his family never treated my sister or I any different than he did his other boys. He spent time with me. He supported me. He challenged me and sincerely loved me through so many good and so many challenging times. I put him through the ringer at times. And when I think about our relationship, what strikes me is the fact that I was never his responsibility to begin with. I wasn't originally his to take care of or his to love. And yet he stepped up and he loved me anyway. And I'm so grateful for that. You know, and I think that's what Jesus intends. For our love to create and build and encourage unity and family, no matter who or where or what we were before Jesus. The love of Jesus has created this new family, and we're not perfect. We've got a lot of strange characters in this family, but we are family all the same. Amen? Lastly here, the love of Jesus perseveres. The love of Jesus perseveres. You know, Jesus' love for his mother and for the disciple, right, is carried to the very end of his life. He's attentive to their needs. He's selfless in his compassion, and he makes sure that both of them will be taken care of long after he's gone. And it's interesting to kind of look back through the Gospels because although it ends in a great place, you know, the dynamic between Mary and Jesus, it wasn't always this supportive. If you look at Mark chapter 3, you know, Jesus, he's beginning his ministry and he's healing people. He's already starting to challenge religious leaders. Crowds are gathering. He's calling for apostles. But when his family hears of what he's doing, they go and actually try to pull him away from it all. They think he is out of his mind. And let me tell you, that is not the kind of support that you want from your family if you're trying to do something important. Let alone if you're trying to do something God is calling you to do, right? But still, after that unbelief and that doubt and that public humiliation, after even questioning his sanity, Jesus honors his mother to the end. Right? And more could be said on this point if the disciple whom Jesus loved was in fact John. Right? If it were John, then this is yet again a great example of persevering love for someone who had failed time and time again. Jesus had to rebuke John at least 3 times throughout the Gospels, if not more. John was actually in the Garden of Gethsemane when Jesus was arrested. And the Gospel authors tell us that all the disciples deserted Jesus and fled, including John, when he was taken into custody, right? And so, despite those failures, Jesus could be giving John another opportunity to love while also taking care of his need for a mother. See, Jesus loved people, whether they deserved it or not. He cared for people, not simply because they were at their best or when they were at their best, but even more so when they were at their worst. His love persevered through failure and persecution and disbelief and misunderstanding and arrogance and even betrayal. Again, how about us? You know, as I was studying this out, I was convicted by this point and convicted of how fickle and conditional my love can be, even for my family or the family of God at times. You know, I can become so critical in my thoughts just because someone's doing something in a way that I wouldn't do it. Or I tend to think, how many times do we have to go through this same thing? How many times do we have to have this same conversation? And rather than love, that love can be replaced by arrogance, by selfishness, by withdrawing from that person, by criticism. Do we have a love like Jesus that perseveres? Do we stick by one another, expressing and showing a love that covers up, like Peter talks about in the New Testament? Are our homes filled with persevering love? Do we continue to give our hearts, no matter how many times they've been hurt or taken for granted? Do we continue to reach out, no matter how many times that effort goes unrecognized or unreciprocated? Do we continue to pray for one another, no matter the circumstance? You know, there have been members of my family that I've been praying for years. And at times it's challenging not to feel like, what is this doing? What is God doing here? At times it feels like they're getting even further away from God, or they're making even worse decisions. I'm challenged to have a love that perseveres. You know, for some of us who have been Christians for a long time, we've seen our children grow up and choose not to follow Jesus. We have got to be praying. We've got to have a love that perseveres. You know, God hasn't given up on them. God hasn't given up on us. We can't give up. And so in closing, as we bring all this together, you know, Jesus has a love that's to be imitated. The love of Jesus is attentive. The love of Jesus is selfless. The love of Jesus creates family. And the love of Jesus perseveres. And I want to close out our time giving the same challenge that John gave in his letter. Those who are loved, let us love. And let us love not according to the standards or the practices of this world or just when it's convenient or comfortable, but let us love like Jesus. Amen.